Right, good morning. Welcome to the public board meeting. Just before we start the formal business, I see Mr. Hogarth sitting there, and can I just congratulate you, David, on being in the birthday honours last week. Terrific and very well deserved. So from that, we go to apologies for absence. We have both Malta and Michael Marr unable to be here today. Can I ask the board if there are any declarations of interest that need to be made? Very good. We had the minutes of the meeting of the 25th of May. Are they a true and accurate record of everything we discussed? Good. Thank you. Those are approved. We've got the action log. A couple of things there are going to be covered in David's report. Is there anything else that people want to raise or matters arising that aren't otherwise covered on the agenda? In which case, David, we go straight to your report, please.
Thanks, Peter. So in terms of the performance report, there's a new style of presentation for this monthly report. My covering report pulls out some of the key issues. Performance on registration is improving, and you'll note the increased volumes in April of this year over and above previous months. NCSC, as we've previously discussed, is continuing to embed the quite significant changes, and whilst performance has dipped, it's now beginning to return, and we anticipate that will continue over this next period. Our inspection activity is consistent with the ratings. If you remember, this next period is going to be driven by the frequency of re-inspection based on the rating that they got, and you can see the graphs that are in the annex which track those through. The delivery of reports in a more timely fashion continues to occupy us, and that work will continue so we can seek improvements in our performance. And then lastly, a brief couple of paragraphs in relation to financial performance, and you'll note that this year we're going to do projections to the end of the year on each month, and we'll continue to show those. So we're currently underspent by about £1 million for the month of April. I'll pause at that point, Peter, because the others are by way of update rather than performance. I'm not going to go through the attached slides. If board colleagues have questions based on the slides, then I'm sure the exec team will endeavour to answer them with me, if that's okay. So if I just pause.
So, David, could I ask, and maybe you or maybe Eileen that knows, do we know why the number of applications has gone up? I mean, it's almost a 50% increase over the sort of normal run. Is there a particular reason? Do we know, or is it just what's happened? So that was my first question, and then secondly, David, you said the normal service is more or less being resumed, but Eileen, I know you've been very close to it, so could you give us an absolute update as to where we are on performance?
So let me begin with performance, Peter. So what is presented is data that's now a week old. So what I have in front of me is data that's actually 2 days old. So the upward trajectory in terms of things which we're flagging as red going to green continues really pleasingly, and I would congratulate all the staff up in Newcastle who are working really hard to do that, and with such commitment and pride in actually getting themselves back into not only previous service level targets, but actually new and more stretching targets in some areas. Those where we would want to give greatest degree of emphasis around everything to do with concerns that come to us, particular effort being put in there, and I'm very pleased to say that there's been very significant uplift in the last week around that. So I want to give people assurance that we take this very seriously, and as I say, the commitment given is that by the end of July everything will be completely in green, but very pleasingly as I say, within the space of the time since the two reports being produced, many more things have become what we would call compliant. And remember, modernisation is not just about the speed, but it's the quality of the interaction that we have. And I'm delighted with the progress being made there. In terms of the applications, we're actually trying to understand that, Peter, to understand trends, where they're coming from. And so we'll come, if it's okay with you, come back to you with further data on that, because we're actually looking at it to understand, is there a particular reason?
Fine. So if you come back at the next board meeting,
Absolutely.
an update. Yep. So an action, please, Catherine. Yep. Thank you. Good. Other questions, Liz? You look see if you want to.
On the slides. Yeah. Thanks. I just wanted to just ask just a couple of things about the new format, because it's been done in a different way. Could I just ask that we don't go entirely to percentages on this, because it's quite important. This is not just an academic point. That we understand where we're seeing a percentage of places that are inadequate or not improving, that we know how many places that means. Just in understanding the magnitude of the problem. Obviously, those percentages translate into numbers of locations, which translate into numbers of people, and I just wouldn't want us to move too far away from the numbers of people. And on that, I do think the re-inspections and the 4 quarters of being in breach are at the heart of this for me for the next year or so. I think that's really the issue that we will need to focus on. I just want it would be a pity to lose some of the detail. So although the new format is a bit easier on the eye, it hasn't got the re-inspections by sector, for example. At least I can't see it if it has. So it's got the 4 quarters for breaches by adult social care and also by primary medical services, but it hasn't when we come to the re-inspected locations. These are overall figures for CQC rather than by sector, and I think that's quite an important, not a detail, that's quite an important and quite a core element of what we know about.
I mean, personally, I very much agree with your statement that this is going to be at the heart of a lot of things that we need to be looking at over the next 12 months, so very supportive.
No, we can make those changes. They're not big issues. The data sits behind it. It's a presentation. We can make those changes. It's a presentation issue. The data sits behind it. It's what's the most helpful. I agree with you on the percentages. We were doing this in the annual report, Lewis. So what does 3% mean in terms of numbers? Yeah. No, it's a good point.
Robert.
I could like just to register a welcome for some figures, as it were, about what is done about whistleblowing information, and I think it potentially is significant that we receive 500 or 600 a month from members of staff. What comes out of it, unless I've got it wrong, is that there are a number of different categories, many of which might be interpreted as actually, if I can put it in a colloquial sense, nothing much happening about the information apart from it being stored. Now, that may be the entirely right action, but when I see a category for the outcome is missing, I'm not quite sure what unqualified whistleblowing, no outcome expected is, I presume, but there are a number of different things there which are different ways of saying we received a telephone call, nothing happened. And I don't want to be that may be an oversimplification. If it is his, I'd like to be corrected. But it is important, I think, that we continue to keep an eye on the quality of the information that comes through, and even more importantly, the quality of what we do about it. And I think this is a good start, if I may say so, to that. Just as a plea, when we've got lines of 0.4%, 0.2%, I had to ask Andrea which colour down this chart those were, because there's a limit to how much I can magnify this on my screen, but that's that's a tiny point. But the substantive point is this is useful information which will be of and should be of interest to the public.
Steve.
Thanks, Peter. I thought it might be helpful, as Lewis raised the issue of breaches, just to explain the histogram that we have in primary care as an illustration of the detail that's available. And that's the chart on that's got a histogram of 149 as of no inspection or enforcement on, and in red. I thought if I explain that, you'd get a better understanding of where we are. Total number of locations covered is almost 20,000. So you're talking about 149 locations out of almost 20,000 locations. That's dentistry and general practice plus others rolled into there. Of those 149 where it says there's no inspection or enforcement planned, there's actually only 17 in that category, and that changes week on week as we plan, because we take that very seriously. 63 of those 149 actually are in the middle of inspections at the moment. 59 are deregistering because of registration issues, which is entirely okay. Practices which are merging or have ceased to trade, and that's all really good work from our registration department. We just have to wait for them to technically deregister. And 10 of them have incorrect recording issues in CRM, and we analyse this every Friday. We go through our breaches because we take it so seriously in each of the teams. And it's just to say that of those 149, we can account for all of them, whereas if you look at it as a histogram and you don't realise what the total number is, it looks stark, but actually we have a plan for all of them, apart from 17, which we, as of today, do have a plan, because this was yesterday.
Steve, I mean, I echo what Lewis said. I think this is just really important, what action we're taking. So I mean, it's helpful to get that update, and we'll probably hold you to doing that in future meetings. Any other points on anybody wants to raise? Okay, David, do you want to carry on?
So I think on this one, Andrea will give me some help, and I think this might be the place just to mention the dispatches programme last night and BUP as well. So in December, the Competition and Markets Authority launched a study into the care home market for people aged over 65, and earlier in June, they published an interim report which made a number of interim recommendations for how they want to take forward their work. They're due to publish a final report in December of this year. They're effectively looking at whether the market in adult social care works in the interest of consumers. So is there transparency about price, what the offer is, et cetera, et cetera. And as consumers, do residents have redress to their consumer rights? So it's a slightly different route into this than the route that we take in relation to the quality and safety of provision. But it is a piece of work that they've come and engaged with us. We've engaged with them over this period. But do you want to just add to that?
Yes, thank you, David. So to reiterate what you've just said, the study is looking at this from a consumer point of view, and the CMA and the team have engaged with us both from a policy perspective, an inspection perspective, and our market oversight team as well. I think if I was to summarise their interim findings, it would be to say this is a market, but it doesn't work very well on behalf of consumers, and we need to do something more about it. And they are continuing with the study, continuing to collect evidence, and what they will be doing over the next 6 months is really considering what the remedies might be around specific areas that they've identified as problems. So our position is that we've welcomed the report. We will obviously continue to work with them, particularly because some of these are issues that we hear from people who are using services and their families and carers, and we know how much distress that causes to people and the support that they need to rectify that. So we will work with the CMA throughout the rest of the year on their continuing study to discuss with them and with the government, who will make the response to the report eventually, what those potential remedies may be and what implications they may have for CQC. And obviously we will bring that back to the board for further discussion as that becomes more evident to us.
Update us on dispatches and BUPA.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity, and I just wanted to say a few words. So I watched the Channel 4 Dispatches programme last night after I got back home after our board dinner, and I think the first thing that I wanted to say was that what we witnessed on that programme was an appalling lack of care in the Crawford's Walk, which was the BUPA care home, which the Dispatches programme had an undercover investigator going into. And I think any of us watching that programme would say we wouldn't want that to happen to anybody that we love. And it's utterly heartbreaking for the people affected and for their families and people watching. Just wanted to reflect on our engagement with this particular home, and to reassure the board that we did not need a dispatcher's undercover investigation to know about the poor standard of care at Crawford's Walk. We had rated this home as inadequate last year, and we were undertaking a follow-up investigation, inspection of Crawford's Walk in March this year, coincidentally, while the undercover investigator was working there. And we were already in the process of taking action to enforce improvements in the home as a consequence of the inspection that we undertook in March, which we further extended on receipt of the information from the Dispatches programme at the beginning of June. We have been very clear to BUPA that the failure to meet the conditions that we've imposed upon them in relation to Crawford's Walk will result in further action, which may include prosecution. In general, with BUPA, I think it's worth saying that they have a clear responsibility to manage their homes and to make those homes homes that are worth living in. And the evidence from last night's programme and our own inspections show that that obligation is not being met in all of their homes. For example, my inspectors should not be arriving at a home at 6 o'clock in the morning to find older people washed, dressed and put back to bed. It's just so unacceptable. We have highlighted our concerns to BUPA, and BUPA has assured us that in relation to Crawford's Walk, they have taken action in relation to individual members of staff. But as far as I'm concerned, it's the culture of the home that also needs addressing. And that culture starts with the expectations, the support and the priorities of the corporate team at BUPA. And we are also engaging with the corporate team at BUPA in following up both on this home and others. We know that many of BUPA's homes provide a good standard of care and others have improved over the last year, but Crawford's Walk is not the only home run by BUPA that we have got concerns about, and we are expecting a concerted effort on behalf of BUPA to address those problems. In terms of what CQC is doing, as I've said, for Crawford's Walk, we were already taking action in relation to this service and had warned the company of the consequences of failing to comply. In relation to poor services across the country, we currently have 3%, as you can see in the board report, 3% of services rated as inadequate. That's over 600 services. To come to your point, Lewis, about percentages are useful, but actually it's the actual locations and then the impact on people, which is the most important thing. So that's over 600 services are inadequate, over 20% of services, nearly 5,000 services we've rated as requires improvement. And so in each of those services, the providers know what their failings are, they know what they need to do, and they know what the consequences are if they don't. We know that when we've rated a service as inadequate, about a third of them cease to operate, either because we force that to happen or the service deregisters. But If they remain in existence, about 3/4 of them do improve, and about half of them improve if we rate them as requires improvement. And I think that indicates that there is more for providers to do to actually address the concerns that we've raised. We are increasing our enforcement action, both against individual providers across the country. There is more that CQC can do, and I think I would point to the consultation documents that we released last week, Peter, which highlighted further improvements that we want to make in our registration and inspection processes. So, for example, making changes to our registration process so that we can register corporate providers to actually hold Bupa to account for these service failings, not just the individual locations as we do at the moment. And we're also identifying further measures that we want to take in relation to those services that remain as requires improvement after re-inspection. There's one other change which is not for us to make, but I think that we need to pursue with the Department of Health, changing our regulations to lift the restrictions on reporting the enforcement actions that are underway, because those regulations at the moment prevent us from saying that. And I think that that means that we cannot share that very important information with the public, which undermines their confidence in us being able to do the job that we're doing, because they can't see it. And I think it would be much better if we were able to share that information. We know that there's good care out there, but we know that there's not enough, that not all care is good enough. About a fifth of services are failing in one way or another. And whilst we as regulators have an important job to do, I think the other thing to say is that this has got to be a collective effort, and it starts with the providers, it starts with Bupa, it starts with their staff, it starts with the commissioners of those services, making sure that all of us are working together to make sure that quality really does matter in these services. And that's what I will continue to do, my teams will continue to do, but we do need other people to work with us as well.
Andrea, thank you. Any Lewis?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Anna, for such an emphatic statement, in particular about the issue of where accountability takes you to the parent organisation as well as to the individual provider. I just wonder, Peter, if this is possible in public session to broaden this out to include the issue of the Grenfell Tower and the fire regulations. It's a particularly frightening thing in care homes. Fire safety is such an important thing in care homes. And, of course, care homes are much smaller. They're physically different. They're not usually tall buildings. But the immobility and frailty of the residents make it a very, very important part of what care home providers have to do. And this question of some of the elements which are now being talked about in relation to the Grenfell fire are there's just an uncomfortable read across into the care home sector. So a cash-strapped local authority without the means to check on whether providers are meeting regulations. Maybe a culture in which regulations are there to be gotten round rather than observed strictly, and so on. So there is it is a particularly important time for us to get this right. And if you look back into previous fires in care homes, you'll find, not just in England but across the UK, you'll find that some of the elements of what people have been talking about in relation to Grenfell are there, including evacuation arrangements, a question of whether people are better to be, residents with mobility problems are better to be in their rooms when there's a fire rather than to be evacuated immediately. That is an issue in care homes which they have to address and have a plan for. When I went on a care home visit a little while ago, the one thing that struck me, and I hope I haven't got this wrong, but it was how much of fire safety came down to self-assessment. And although there is advice and guidance, in the end it does depend on providers doing the right things and having policies and training and procedures and checking and drills and all that sort of thing. And obviously the problem there is that self-assessment can be good or it can be fairly flimsy. And I was struck in the care home that I went to how perfunctory self-assessment had become, and how the local authority hadn't really had the resource to do the check that it maybe needed to do. And so it does concern me. And then for us, at CQC going into a care home, there is the corresponding concern that we are then coming in and looking at fire safety, and we're relying on the same sort of paperwork, which has been potentially quite hastily thrown together through self-assessment. And we're relying on that. Our inspectors, who are not necessarily expert in every aspect of fire safety, and they're also looking at hygiene and infection control, all these other areas of safety, are having to depend on some of the paperwork. And I just wonder whether we will, given that this is such an important point for the residents, whether we can get to, whether there's as a development, a more intense scrutiny that we can provide. I take your point about ultimately this is the responsibility of the providers themselves, but in our capacity as regulator, whether we can get to a point where we can provide a more intensive scrutiny of some of the how they apply the safety regulations in practice.
So if I can respond, Peter, thank you, and you kind of echoing some of my own personal sentiments, Lewis, in terms of thinking through what can we learn from what happened in the absolutely dreadful disaster last week in Grenfell Tower. And we have had our own issues. There was a fire, for example, in Hertfordshire not that long ago, where fortunately all residents were evacuated and there was no loss of life. But it kind of points to the real issues that there are, as you quite rightly say, in care homes. We do, as you obviously have observed on the inspection that you went on, ask about fire safety. It is one of the key aspects of our key line of inquiry under safety in when we ask whether the service is safe. And yes, we will look at the information that is provided, but we will also undertake our own observations about, for example, how fire exits are supported, whether care plans have appropriate information in them about supporting people if they need to be evacuated and those kind of things. And we have raised on a number of occasions issues about fire safety in reports and with providers, and have gone back to those services subsequently to check that those changes that we've requested have been made. We work very closely with the Fire Authority. I know only in the last 2 weeks that we've been into one particular service, highlighted concerns about blocked fire exits, raised that with the Fire Authority, and they have been taking further action themselves. One of the things that we have been doing is thinking about how we can improve how we do all of that, and this particularly was as a consequence of the fire in Hertfordshire, which kind of prompted us to think that we needed to absolutely make sure that we were being clear about our expectations of providers, but also equipping our staff to do this as well as they could. So we have created what we've called an environment checklist, which will assist inspectors to be assiduous in the things that they're checking when they go on inspections. So making sure that they're not just relying on the self-assessment from providers. But David has already commissioned a piece of work as a consequence of last week's fire across all three of our sectors, because to be honest, all of us have got environments where people are in vulnerable circumstances, substance and misuse services, for example, for Mike, and et cetera, et cetera. To look at what we've been doing, what findings we've been making, what more we can do, and what further partnerships we should be strengthening with the fire authorities and others to actually try and make sure that we're protecting people as far as we possibly can.
Thank you. Are we happy to move on? Oh, sorry, Rob. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Slightly different one. The Competition and Market Authority report. So, I've only read the executive summary of that report, and it struck me some of the remarks made about complaints handling and redress and so on. I would have thought, but I may be wrong, the sort of part of what we would be looking at when we go and inspect homes. Is that right? Is there are there any lessons within that so far about what we ought to be doing in relation to the inspections that we do?
Yes, so one of the things that they have picked up is how responsive people are to complaints that are raised, and that, of course, is part of the question that we look at when we're looking at whether a service is well led and whether a service is responsive. To be honest, our focus is on the quality issues that people raise rather than necessarily the contractual issues, and that's not what we tend to get into in terms of those problems. And if people do have complaints that are not addressed appropriately, then their recourse is to the local government and social care ombudsman, who have renamed themselves to make it absolutely blindingly clear that they are the authority to whom people go for further redress if they're not having their problems resolved by the local provider. But I think that there is, and this is one of the areas that we want to work on with the Competitions and Markets Authority, and I know that the Department of Health is interested in this as well, is, what more could we do? What more should we do? What should others be doing? Where is that appropriately sat? And what capacity do we need to have? And what further skills do we need to have to actually look at some of the issues that the CMA have been raising? So there is more work for us to do, certainly.
Thank you.
Good, thank you. So that takes us on to the update from the Hospitals Directorate, which I think is self-explanatory, isn't it? Unless anybody wants to ask anything. And then, Pete, we get to the... if I can say the word... oh, sorry, Mike.
It should. Can I just expand a little bit on the,
Yep.
on the issue of the convicted surgeon? I mean, I think just to assure people that we are taking this issue very seriously, and have indeed been for some time, because of course we have known about the issues relating to Ian Patterson for years. We've had the report from his NHS practice, but equally we inspected the two Spire hospitals where he practiced back in 2015, and if you look at the reports from those, Spire Little Aston and Spire Parkway, we make specific reference to the report that was undertaken by Verita there, and that has actually helped us in our thinking about how we assess governance in private hospitals. I think a key issue is about practicing privileges. Are surgeons, and indeed others as well as surgeons, undertaking similar work in the NHS and in the private sector? Ian Patterson was not. He was doing colonoscopies in private practice, but not in the NHS. But are people operating on children in the private sector, but not in the NHS? Would be another example. But we're also working very closely with a range of other organisations to see how we can strengthen this, particularly at this stage, the insurers, because they often know, well, they do know who the outliers are. And I think our partnership working with insurers has become a lot stronger since we've been doing these inspections, and they are now bringing to our attention areas where they are concerned. But it's also about the scope of practice, but are they undertaking multidisciplinary team assessments before they operate, and can they demonstrate that? What are they doing to audit outcomes afterwards? And we're also working with the GMC and indeed with Royal Colleges and the Department of Health to look at lessons learned from this. But I think already we've got a much stronger approach, but I think it can be strengthened further.
Great. Yes.
Briefly on that,
yes,
because it's such an important case that no, I agree with you, Mike. A crucial issue is the sort of operating privileges of practices. It seems extraordinary to be going beyond your area of expertise because you're in the private sector, but. There is another point, I think, as well, though, and just want to ask whether there's another area, another lesson, not a lesson exactly for us, but something for us to consider for the future, and that's whether there were warning signs in the system, either from the relatives. I mean, there are these very emotive interviews in the media with relatives, of course, now, but to what extent was that coming through before? And also, not just from the relatives, but also from other members of staff, because that seemed to me to be the bit of the system that hasn't been quite explored in what we've heard about this case so far.
I think that point about staff concerns is a really important one, and I was talking to Sir Robert earlier today about what might we be thinking of in the future about freedom to speak up guardians in the private sector as well as in the NHS, because I think there is an issue of do nursing staff, for example, or operating theatre staff observe practice that they think may not be right, but are they being dissuaded from coming forward about that? Now, we would always try on our inspections to ask them, but I think there may be better ways that we could try and hear the voice of staff in particular. I think in terms of patients and relatives, obviously the issues related to Ian Patterson predate our new inspection methods, but I do believe that there were concerns being raised before they came to light formally.
Could I just say briefly about that, the Verita report, which of course was done some time ago in relation to this matter, to my mind had distressing echoes, not only of the Mid Staffordshire report, but also of the Neil report, which was all about another consultant who drifted around the system with people apparently knowing that he wasn't as good as the patients thought he was. And it does, I think, highlight perhaps the need for this organisation to scrutinise very carefully the ability of staff and indeed patients to be listened to in independent hospitals.
So there is a point we need to come back to, Mike. Robert, yeah. Okay.
And we are working internally,
yes,
and with colleagues in Department of Health and Royal Colleges, etc. But we will come back
to the board. That's what I meant. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so are we now okay to move on to the digital strategy update? David, do you want to say anything? Or
yeah, well, Peter's here, and the purpose of this is just to give the board some reassurance about momentum. It's moved on since the last time, and you can see there are 3 projects which are now advancing quite significantly. And the report also has content about the additional work which is going to be put in place and the progress that is being made. So I'm not inviting a big debate on this, Peter. I think this is just to give you a sense of it's here, and Peter's here just to symbolically demonstrate that we're in business and moving. I did agree that line with him earlier. I'm going to push on, unless you stop me, to the performance assessment regulations.
Yep, we're going to stop you. Dora.
Sorry, just one, David. I think it's good progress has been made, and it's quite a significant deal of progress that's being made. I think one of the things that it does feel a bit of a technology update, where we've got dates and milestones, which are important. But I think also we shouldn't miss the benefits of why we're doing these things. So I think on the 3 projects, like there's one saying we're going to improve the intranet, but I don't really know what that actually means. And I think if we could just pick out the large-scale benefits, it would just help us focus. Rather than becoming project managers, we'll focus actually on the outcomes that you and your team are trying to achieve, Pete. The other area for me was that you've picked an external provider, which is great. But you're doing an agile project, and most external providers are fixed price. And I'd be interested, maybe not now, but I'd be interested at some point, how you're going to manage that side of it, the whole governance of an external versus internal, where you can shift your internal staff quite easily to work on other things as decisions are being made. And the final point was there was a statement about gaps in capacity and capability, and I'm not sure if that's going to impact your outcomes. There was a statement about significant gaps. I just wondered. Sorry? Yeah, I just wondered if that's going to impact your schedules in any way.
Thanks, Stuart. Coming back on this point, so benefits, totally agree. We need to present that in a different way next time. We will do so. So they are there. I think a few key pieces about that, though. It's about how we're shaping the project. So a critical piece that we've achieved on this first project that we've mobilised with the external supplier is to get the right level of business involvement, or organisational involvement, so that we're driving it from the benefits to the user. So Liz Owen, who was interim director of intelligence before Helen arrived, has picked up that role explicitly and is now sitting with the development team, making sure we're driving the benefits to the end user and not the technology. So we're shaping that piece correctly. In terms of the external provider for that particular project, while they're external, they are here. So they've come on site, they're sitting with the team, they're not the entirety of the team. Part of their remit is knowledge transfer to make sure that the rest of the team understand how to work in agile ways. But also we're sitting a certain amount of development capacity alongside them that can be moved up and down along the project. So that gives us the flex you were talking about within. There is a fixed price envelope for the main scope of work, but the scope of work is for that outcome, and that outcome is reliant on integration with other systems and services in the business. So there's a degree of flex in those areas that we need to get right. So we're making that happen. We've also put together enough in terms of commercial arrangement understanding with suppliers of other systems so that we can flex those pieces without them impacting the project deliverables. So all of those things that have happened to make this the environment for agile delivery possible within that project. In terms of the gaps in capability, so there clearly are some. I think there are some in terms of roles that were in the paper for last month, so product ownership, for example, testing at the beginning of the process rather than at the end of the process, those sorts of things we need to understand and move forward. There are some pieces around overall data management that need to be improved. We will be bringing in some external assistance to help with those, not to replace the teams that are doing it internally, but partly it's about upskilling and changing the methods and the processes. But we need to do that fairly rapidly. And those are the projects that we're looking at first in terms of the next pieces we'll bring to the investment committee to make sure that we're moving those capabilities forward rather than just the end outcomes.
All right. Good. We're happy to move on. David?
So the performance assessment regulations, these are changes that we've asked that are made so we can rate services which we are currently not able to rate: termination of pregnancy, cosmetic surgery providers, etc., ensuring there's parity in the approach between NHS and private providers as laid out there. So there's got to be an additional short period of consultation that must be completed over the summer if the regulations are going to be developed and changed to come into effect from October of this year. In paragraphs 7 and 8, I'm just drawing attention to publications that were made over the past few weeks, the consultation documents, and also the driving improvements case studies, both of which have been published since our last board meeting. So I'll pass on those. And then two finals, if I may, Peter. One is just to give the opportunity for the board to acknowledge Professor Ted Baker has been appointed to succeed Mike when he retires. I know we did a press release yesterday, was it? Yesterday, I think. But it also gives the board the opportunity just to acknowledge that. And then the very last bit, and it was touched on earlier in our private conversation with David Hogarth here, just to put on the public record that we will take the opportunity to review the guidance on video and the use of video in care homes during the course of this year, and that's a part of our work programme. I think this might also touch on some of the issues around fire security, etc. as well, so we can look at that in the round. Thank you.
So thank you, David. I think just on Ted's appointment, firstly, I think I'm sure all of us would want to congratulate Ted, and secondly, I think it's just important, as was in the press release, that this was an appointment following an extensive external process. We had a very strong field of people applying, so Ted was absolutely the outstanding person at the end of the day, and I'm delighted he's been appointed. But I mean, it should show that I think the board wants to congratulate him. Okay. Anything else from David's report anybody wants to raise? Good. So we thank you, Pete, as always, and we'll move on to health and safety, which probably means there's some people outside the room going to join us. Eileen, if you'd be kind. You're very welcome to stay. It's a public, but if you've that fully understood, you have other things to do.
Go write next month's report.
Thanks, Pete, very much indeed. Thank you. Welcome. There's something in the water, I think, that's making everybody very garrulous today. So we are running way behind schedule. I do apologise that you've been kept waiting, but it's not because we don't think that health and safety is really important. So I'm just going to I don't know, anybody, David, wants to introduce this, or am I just going to hand straight over to Eileen?
Let me just do this. So one of the big challenges is how does a board accept its responsibilities around health and safety? And if that didn't come out in spectacular fashion with a disaster at Grenfell Park, I don't know what more of a reminder we need about what our responsibilities are. Fortunately, this went in the agenda before that happened, and I think what the team are going to do is actually just take us through some of the key issues and the challenges for us based on our role and what we've got to do. So if I just hand over, are you going to kick it off, Max, and take us through it? And,
yes, yeah, thank you.
It's possibly worth also just pointing out, Max has a history and a background in fire safety as a previous chief officer of a fire service, so he comes particularly well equipped to help us and support us on this one. Well, to lead this work for us, but to help us and support us. And I think remind us of our responsibilities as leaders, really. Health and safety is not Max's job, it's our job. Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. So myself and Leslie are going to do a double-hander. I think we've got about 15 minutes, so hopefully we'll rattle through some slides that you should have, and then some questions or discussion at the end, hopefully. So first off, it was why manage health and safety, and as David said, really, I think there's some, compelling moral arguments, legal arguments, of course, and financial arguments that make it important. We've sent round a soft copy of this, which should be on board pad, which is a very useful IOD HSE document about board members' responsibilities. So I would urge you to take the time to read that. But underpinning all of this is the Health and Safety at Work Act from 1974.
Yeah, the Health and Safety at Work Act underpins all health and safety in this country and places specific duties on employers to manage health and safety. The more senior your position in an organisation, the more onerous those duties are. All employers are required to provide certain things under the Health and Safety at Work Act. So, for example, we're required to provide safe plant, safe systems of work, and safe places of work for our employees to make sure that they're protected while they're working for us. The Health and Safety at Work Act isn't prescriptive. It allows employers to consider what's reasonable and proportionate after taking into account the level of risk that the organisation has. There's over 50 substantive regulations that are made under the Health and Safety at Work Act, one of those being the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations, which is an absolute requirement to carry out risk assessments for all of our activities. Employees also have duties under the Act, and that is to take care of themselves and anyone else who might be affected by the work that we carry out. Failure to comply with these requirements can have serious consequences.
Okay. So that's the scary bit, if you like, the legislative background. But as I said, it's something we want to do, and good employers obviously want to adopt good practice in managing health and safety. I think it's fair to say it's not something that we've neglected in the past, but it was perhaps not as systematic as it might have been. So we've had some internal audits that have identified that. So we've had good policies in various parts, but it's been a little bit hit and miss on occasion in terms of how we've actually been maintaining it and implementing it. So as following up from the audits, we've done quite a bit here. We've got a new staffing structure in place. Myself, Leslie's joined us. We've moved health and safety over to the FCI directorate, so it fits nicely with our estates function as well, because obviously keeping our buildings safe is important. Updated the policy. We've got a strategy going to ET next week, and we've adopted the health and safety plan, do, act, check model, which is actually set out in here as well. We've undertaken a risk profiling exercise, so we've got teams of people together from across the organisation to look at the activities that we undertake and carry out a risk profiling exercise, which looked at level of risk presented, but also what mitigation we've got in place, just to give us a sense of what our priorities should be. And we've got the action plan and a revitalised health and safety committee. So the main body that sort of looks after health and safety in the organisation is a quarterly joint committee with trade unions, chaired by Kate, where we look at performance and policies and all those sorts of things. Okay. Just talking about the risk profile, so on to slide 3, I think it is. It identified 2 specific areas. There's all the things that you would expect to see in place around governance, so we need to make sure that we've got the right strategy and plans in place, the right policies, and that those are kept up to date, they're communicated well, and all those sorts of things. But the operational risks, I think, they're unique to any organisation, and ours, we've got, I think, identified a number of specific risks. I think if you were to ask Leslie, she describes us as being fairly low risk, low incidence, and we'll come on to that in a few minutes, but that doesn't mean we're without risk. And there are some things that our staff do that do present risks that we need to focus on managing better. So lone working is one specific risk. We have people going out, carrying out inspections out of hours by themselves, sometimes in premises where we know there have been issues with behaviour of managers or staff, and so they meet aggression and occasionally violence, so that's a risk. Driving at work, you'll see the stats further on, so that's a risk for us. A lot of our inspectors clock up a lot of miles, sometimes after quite long working days. Home working is always that interesting dilemma between, is it a sort of workplace, is it your home? But the risks need to be managed, while they're working for us, it effectively is their workplace. And then workstation safety affects sort of all of us who use computers, which is pretty much everybody. So that's, for us as an organisation, actually been quite a high level of risk to manage, just because of the high volume of workstation activity that we have. Leslie, do you want to talk about the stats?
Chart 4 in your pack highlights the accidents, our past performance to date. And you can see some of the headlines show that there's been a year-on-year reduction from 61 accidents in 2014 to 41 accidents in 2016-17. Quite low for the number of staff that we have, which may suggest under-reporting of accidents in the areas. We ask staff to report all accidents to us, no matter how minor they may be. If they result in an injury or in ill health, we like to know so that we can investigate and look at the mitigating circumstances to make sure that these accidents don't happen again in future. On that note, we've recently relaunched the accident and incident reporting policy to make it easier and quicker for staff to report accidents. On slide 5, you'll see that that's accidents by cause. And as Max said, some of the most frequent causes of accidents are road traffic accidents relating to inspection staff and slips, trips and falls, which reflects the national trend, and that's across inspections and officers. Although looking at accidents is sometimes considered to be a reactive way of assessing performance, I think it gives us a good idea of where problem areas may be and where we need to put our resources.
Well, I think I'm pretty certain, like Leslie, that there is under-reporting in the organisation, so we want people to raise incidents and accidents, so near misses as well. So where there's a good health and safety climate, normally you get a high level of near-miss reporting as well, because that shows people are sort of risk aware, and it enables us to sort of look at the how we're managing health and safety. But and interestingly, the sort of slips, trips and falls often sounds a little bit sort of low level, but we've had 2 broken bones in this building in the last sort of 2 months, I think, as a result of slips and trips. So it does happen, and sometimes the consequences can be long, lengthy periods off work. Okay. So this is the bit that I suppose is targeted more at yourselves. So what's required of you? Unlike all things in life, I think where you see good practice, you see good leadership. So health and safety, needs to be led. It just doesn't happen by itself. We'll do the best that we can, but we need sort of strong, visible leadership, an active commitment. And I know many of you know this already. It does make a difference. It does count. People pick up on what leaders are doing, what they're saying, what behaviours they're exhibiting. So leadership is important. Obviously, integrating with our business decisions as well is important. So thinking about safety when we're thinking. So we've been talking with colleagues in look at project management of the organisation to make sure that step's built into our project management processes as well. Engagement with workers. We have really good working relationships with the trade unions, so we meet with them regularly. We try and do joint communications. So I think the accident investigation policy is we're communicating it to our staff, but the TUs are sending out the same message to their members as well. So good partnership working is important, and again that can be reinforced at board level as well. And then I think the last area is something we were perhaps not as good as we might have been at, and it's always the sort of the bit that sometimes gets neglected is actually getting everything in place but keeping on top of it and making sure it's working. So carrying out assessments, audits, reviewing performance, and then changing things that need to be changed. So we've had a couple of internal audits that are keeping us honest and keeping us a list of changes that we're working through. But I think the question that we wanted that you just to consider was, you've got a responsibility under the law. How do you want to discharge that? We've got ACGC who take risk-related reports, so that's one means of doing that. We provide annual reports to ET, but I suppose open for discussion.
Great, that's really good, and the papers that you sent round in advance were, I thought anyway, very helpful, particularly the IOD papers. So thank you for that. Lewis,
can I just ask about the place of psychological safety here, because the law does cover stress at work as well, doesn't it? And so I guess it's easier sometimes to talk about accidents and incidents because they're easier to count and so on, and the solutions are more physical. But it would be useful to get an idea of what it can mean for a board to take responsibility for for stress-related illness and psychological safety in a workforce.
Yeah, I mean, so our Health and Safety Committee is our Health, Safety and Wellbeing Committee, so we work very closely with People Directorate. Stress is absolutely part of that, and it's like all organisations, it's something that does occur, and it manifests itself in different ways. Even this sort of aggression can cause stress in people. We've had people reporting various things that's causing them concern. So stress, work-related stress is very real and something that we are looking at. As well as the sort of prevention is always better than cure, so we're working with people on preventative strategies and understanding what the problems are, but also we need to make sure that we can mitigate it when it does happen. Leslie, I don't know if you want to...
We have a very good managers toolkit to help managers to manage their staff who may be suffering from work-related stress. And just lately we've started to keep a better record of people who are suffering so that we can help them in a more focused way. And I guess that could be something that the board would like to see, statistics around that and how we've managed to resolve those issues.
Robert, sorry. Then Paul.
I mean, Lewis asked about psychological health, understandably that's his interest, but physical health is also important. I notice you talk about workstation safety. It seems to me that in most workplaces there are all sorts of issues around not sight, eyesight, positioning, lifting weights, and I don't know, inspectors probably don't to put everything on a laptop rather than carrying lots of files around. But we got a system for. Well, look at Mike. There you go. He doesn't know what a laptop is.
I have a nice lightweight iPad.
But are we satisfied? How do we satisfy ourselves we're on top of those sort of issues?
So we've got policies and procedures in place. We provide equipment for people to carry files, so sort of pilot's bags with wheels and various things. We sort of set out what's reasonable for people to do. We can arrange things to be couriered. We do encourage people, to travel light, as it were. But we've also assessed jobs in the organisation that might involve lifting and carrying, so we provide manual handling training for those particular posts. But I think it's still something, it's a sort of a work in progress. There's still probably a staff awareness issue there about, what should they be carrying and how best to carry it or transport things. We have had some issues raised by people, claiming they're having to carry too much, but not actually following the guidance or using the equipment that's provided to them. So I think a lot of it is sort of communicating about what they should be doing, but what's available, what does the organisation provide.
Just to sort of follow up, whether is the really question for the board rather than you, the health and wellbeing committee, our means of satisfying ourselves on this board of the matter. I noticed that the guidance you mentioned that there should be a non-executive director sort of scrutinising this stuff, but is that the means by which we are doing it through that committee?
I think we're doing it through a variety of means, Robert. I don't think it's just through that committee. I think we have data that comes here which is in the aggregate but would alert us to, if there was a problem which would then cause us to want to investigate further. There's already referred to internal audit reports that Paul and his committee will see. We do obviously. All of us are shadowing inspections. We're out and about, so I think again we see what goes on. I was very concerned about safety of our people doing prison visits. Actually, spent time not only talking to our team, but then just going to see for myself how we keep people safe in those environments. So I think there's a lot of things that we do, and I think just that one committee would be my view for the board. Paul, you wanted to raise something, but you might want to confirm what I just said or disagree with it.
No, I would certainly confirm what you're saying, but I think ACGC, when they were considering the health and safety reports from internal audit, also recommended that this is brought forward to the board here. So I think we're getting that right. I had one comment in relation to your question and one question. The comment in relation to the question about what does the board do, I think we need to see that health and safety strategy and the implementation plans, if you like, for that strategy, and then we can understand how we reinforce that with actions by the board and that send the right messages out, because it is about the right messages going out mainly around that. My question was the physical violence statistics, where there appear to be 5 instances of physical violence. I assume that's by other outsiders on our staff rather than staff on staff, but I may be wrong on that. But I'm slightly surprised, maybe I've missed the meetings, but we haven't actually seen something at the board about physical violence. If we have physical violence against a member of staff, I think the board ought to know that's happened. What do you think about that?
Yes, the incidents were physical violence on a member of staff, usually not by another member of staff, usually by an external third party. Yes, I think, in my opinion, it would be something to bring to the board that you should be aware of. It's a very important issue. It's not a huge issue, but when it happens, it can have massive consequences, not only for the organisation, but for the member of staff. So, yeah.
I'm fine with that as a routine report when it happens. To be honest, I'm surprised it's not more. Just in the environments in which we operate at times, but any one is too many. I fully accept. Anything else anybody wants to raise on this? I think it's been a really, really helpful paper and session just now. A few action points, Catherine, which you all have noted. And we're clearly going to be seeing you again. So thank you very much indeed. Okay. And we need to move swiftly on. But, Paul, it's back with you, I think, with the annual report from the ACGC.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Peter. I think the report is pretty self-explanatory. There's an element of reporting what we've done during the year, and also an element of reporting what the main findings were. And I think paragraph 3 summarises the main points which have come out of the processes during the year and the sorts of things that we're looking forward in terms of needing to get assurance around in the future. As the board will know, we're also looking today at the annual report and accounts in draft form, and within that there is quite a long piece on our assessment, the organisation CQC's assessment in the governance statement of where it's at on its management assurance processes, and the head of internal audit's opinion on where we're at in terms of governance and risk management and control. I think what I would say is that the progress that's really started 2 years ago has been maintained, and we are seeing at ACGC evidence that the organisation is getting much better at its internal control and its risk management, and also its governance not just in the finance area, where there has been a significant improvement in terms of not the reporting of the finance, but actually the control processes in finance to make sure we're spending our money wisely and that we're being efficient. And there's been a big improvement in that over the 2 years, but also across the whole area of our operations, we're doing a lot better in terms of actually making sure we're more efficient and that we are managing ourselves appropriately. There is still more to do. Of course, we're not perfect yet. There are still things to do, and we will be monitoring areas around next year around the implementation of the new strategy and the assurance that we've got around that, around the digital in particular, and also around the development of the new inspection processes and inspection regimes. So I think that kind of summarises where we're at, and I'm happy to take any questions.
I thought it was a really good report. Thank you, Paul, and I think it's a really good committee, so thank you for that as well. Are there any questions or comments anybody wants to make, or are we happy just to note the report?
Well, can I just say,
yeah, Robert.
As a member of the committee, how impressed I am by the response of the executive team and all we work for them in terms of to the various audits that take place. It seems to me there's a really healthy structure and insight there, which I somewhat doubt that some other organisations have.
Good, thank you. So we'll note that report, move on to the RGC report. Michael's obviously not here, although he has presented the written report. Again, I think it's self-explanatory. I think it's a very good committee. It's a committee which, unlike the others, all of us as non-executives are invited to attend and indeed do attend, as well as the executive team from time to time. So is there anything anybody wants to raise, or are we just happy to note that? So I think we'll note it, and in Michael's absence, and given that this would have been Michael's last meeting if he had been able to be here, we should just thank him for his work on the RGC, as well as, of course, for his work on the board. And as I said previously, I'm really pleased that Michael's going to stay involved with us and feed in his thoughts from time to time. which is really, really helpful. Good. Is there any other business from the board before we go to members of the public? Right. So we have literally only a few minutes, but ladies and gentlemen, is there anything you'd like? We have to come to you, David, first. I think in the circumstances, it has been said that only people called David get into the honours list in health. Although there are odd exceptions apparently. David, do you want to go and take a microphone and for the record, say who you are, and obviously.
I'm David Hogarth, and I'm the coordinator of a charity looking after older people in St John's Wood, North London. I was, of course, very pleased to hear that you were going to be looking again at the guidance, both for providers and for the general public about the use of cameras. That is, provided that they will become even more encouraging than they were before. In this. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about a bit of research I did recently. We looked at the cases in April when this was adult social care, where a rating of required improvement or inadequate had been given in the caring domain, and we were looking back to see how this related to the key lines of inquiry, to which there are a number of prompts in the key lines of inquiry, and to see which ones were being picked up on most. And particularly, we wanted to see how far they related to kindness and compassion, which I tend to believe is perhaps the most important thing of all in the caring domain. There were, in fact, about just over 70 such cases of this kind, but only 9 of them related to kindness and compassion. Most of them were about other things, other failings. So then we looked a little bit more at the detail of the evidence which was being used to suggest that there was a failing in kindness and compassion. In every care home case, it was observational evidence, usually from the SOFI, the short observational technique. And I was very impressed, actually, with the things that the inspectors were picking up just by sitting in the dining room and watching the staff, the interactions between the staff and the residents. I've slightly forgotten what I got to. That was anyway the research that we have recently done. But what I did feel reading these things was that although you had given them a required improvement or inadequate rating as a result of what you saw in the dining room, I wondered in a way if this was always justified, given that to give such a rating to a care home is quite damaging to it, makes it less competitive. It seemed to me that what you were discovering through the SOFI was actually clues and suggestions about what might be wrong, but because of the nature of inspection, you weren't really able to pursue those more. And what I would like to suggest, and this brings us back to the question of surveillance, whether cameras or acoustic, is that when you pick up these things, rather than just giving a required improvement rating, you would actually pursue them, and you would pursue them, of course, a great deal more easily if there was also CCTV or something similar in place where you could go back to the management and say, we'd like to look at the relevant CCTV to see whether what we saw was just a flash in the pan or was indicated some widespread problem. So that is really just the only thing. If you'd like to comment about possibly whether that might be one of the things, for example, in the end of programme report in the adult social care, you presumably will have some section looking forward to what you might be doing next, whether that might be one of the things you might be doing.
Yeah, David, do you want?
David, thank you. That was a brilliant editorial job on reports that we've not yet written that we are about to produce. And can I just give a commitment that we'll consider all those? I think the point you make, which we've considered earlier as a board, which is since we produced that guidance on technology, not just video surveillance, but technological surveillance 3 years ago, technology has moved on in quite a sophisticated way, and I think it's right that we consider that. So your point is well landed, and we will share with you the end of programme reports when we publish that in a few weeks' time.
Good, thank you. We've got time for one more question. Yes, please. You'd like to go to where David was sitting, and when you get there, if you press the button on the microphone, that's it. There should be a red light. Come on, it has. If you'd like to introduce yourself and then go from there, please.
Okay, my name's Helen Rochester. I'm a former nurse. I've worked in the NHS for about, it was a good 20 years. And I've also worked in adult social care, both as a nurse and as a carer. Now, I've come to talk to you today about something that's quite close to my heart and has been touched upon quite a lot in here this morning, which is whistleblowing. And what spurred me to come on was that I watched the video report of, I think it was the April board meeting, where I think it was that lady sitting to your right, Mr. Chairman, that was explaining to board exactly what a whistleblower is. And she couched it in some quite legal terms, and I think she might be, yeah, she is a legal person. I just wanted to come and tell you what they actually are, and from a personal perspective, and how we're treated in the care sector because of that, and also, unfortunately, how I've been treated by the Care Quality Commission for doing it as well. Now, what we are is your eyes and ears on the ground in care homes in all the times that you are not there, which is basically most of the time. And we will go to the employer and we will raise concerns if we're brave enough to do it, and I have been brave enough to do it. And generally, you are treated pretty miserably by the employer. They make your life hell. They do not listen to what you say, and they will either find a reason to get rid of you or you will leave anyway, which is what I did. So when I left, and this is on 2 occasions now, in the last 4 years, when I left, I thought, well, that's great for me. I no longer have to work there now. I can go off and do something else. But it's not so great for those residents who I had some really, really bad concerns on. So I went to the CQC. You are the prescribed authority to go if we don't think that employers are acting, or if they haven't acted, this is where we come. On both occasions, and I realise it's only 2 occasions, but when we're talking in percentages, it is 100% of the time. On both occasions, I got a standard response from the CQC saying, thank you very much for your concerns. We're passing on the relevant bits to adult safeguarding. We will use it to inform our next inspection. On both times. Now, on the first occasion, you finally got yourself up to that care home 9 months later after I raised concerns, which is not really acceptable. But when you did get yourself up there, you issued 3 enforcement notices, and they were on all of the things that I had raised 9 months previously. Now, that is 64 vulnerable residents left at risk for 9 months because you didn't listen to me. Also, I found out, because at the time there was an employment tribunal claim raised, so I got an awful lot of disclosure behind the scenes as to what was going on. Your inspector was talking about me as a whistleblower to the employer, who did a marvellous job of trashing me to the inspector, and that had some sort of influence on why you did not act at the time. Now, you did act eventually, and that is good, and the home was rated as inadequate. You put in a whole raft of improvements, and they were eventually acted upon. Now, that was 4 years ago, and I raised a complaint through your complaints procedures, and I was given a complete runaround for 3 months. And then the head of inspection at the time come to my home and said, this will not happen again. We are learning lessons. We should not be discussing whistleblowers with employers, etc., etc., etc. And I listened to her. I thought, yes, you will put things in place to deal with that. And I was totally impressed with the response that I got. The fact that she'd come out to my home to tell me that, I was completely impressed with that. So then it happens again in 2017. I've just walked out of a care home. I worked there for 4 nights. I couldn't bear what I was seeing in that home. And it was similar to what, is it Andrea? Yeah, it was similar to what she was saying. It is completely unacceptable to go into a care home at 6 o'clock in the morning and see patients getting dragged out of bed. It was happening at 4:15 in this care home. And that was amongst a whole raft of other things that were happening in terms of the health and safety of the residents, also the health and safety of the staff, which you have touched on in this board meeting here this morning as well. And it's actually the same thing happened. The employer treated, well, I just resigned and walked out and then have been subjected to a whole load of counter allegations. But that employer and the CQC inspector that I went to at the time was discussing me with the employer, again, after all the assurances that I was given 4 years ago that it wouldn't happen again. I've got an email here. It says, HR, as discussed on the telephone, private and confidential. That was from your inspector. Now, what assurances? Because now I don't feel that I can come to the CQC, 1, trust that you're going to act, and 2, trust that you are going to protect me if I do come to you and get all this sort of thing. What assurances you can give going forward that won't happen again?
Okay, so you very kindly gave me advance notice of your question, but
I think
because
it might have changed slightly. But
well, no, you broadened it out, but so I was aware you were the generality, and as it happens, I was visiting. I thought rather a good care home yesterday, and so by the time I got back from that and a meeting I had afterwards, it was quite late in the day. So all I've been able to do on your specific case is to establish that you have made a formal complaint about CQC. There is an investigation that we have in progress, and therefore it's really not appropriate in A, because the investigation is in progress, and B, because obviously it concerns not just you but our members of staff. So I'm not going to go in today to your specific case.
I didn't expect
fine.
I did expect you to do it generally going forward.
Thank you. So what I was going to say to you, as far as your own case is concerned, when the investigation is complete, if you're not really happy with what we've come back to you with, I'm very happy to meet you to discuss it. And so that's an offer that's on the table. 2 sort of general points you made. One, yes, Rebecca gave a very legal definition because I asked her to give a very legal definition, because we are really reliant on the public, which includes both staff members and patients and residents and families and everybody else, to give us information. Most of those people do not regard themselves as whistleblowers, but obviously there is a protected category of people who are whistleblowers. You would have been one of them. So that was why I just wanted in the last meeting to get that definition. And I think it is fair to say that we do take very seriously protecting the anonymity of whistleblowers where it is possible to do so. And I'm not going to go any further because I think that does get into your individual case. But we will have a meeting after the investigation is complete and continue the discussion if you would like to do that.
That's fine within my individual case, and I'm very happy to do that. But, going forwards, if I was put into that same situation again, I would feel very reticent coming to the CQC in the first place. 1, because you don't seem to act, and secondly, because of what's happened. Now, you might put personally might put measures in place after this investigation, and that would be great, and that would solve one part of the issue. But what concerns me is that in 100% of the occasions that I have raised things, I have got these standard responses saying, thank you very much, we'll put it on file and use it in the future.
So your challenge is a good one, and as Chief Executive I don't think we're consistent enough on this issue, and therefore I will personally see the response before it goes out to you. I'm not going to intervene in that response, but I will personally see it. Peter's offered, and one of the things, once that response comes back to me, we'll have a discussion at our senior team about whether our practice in relation to whistleblowing is consistent enough with our policies in relation to whistleblowing. And we can give you that assurance. It's on the public record. This is videoed. Other people can see it. And that will be our commitment to you.
Good. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you all for coming. We really do have to end now. Board, our next session is on the third floor. Sorry?
It's going to be here.
It's here now. Oh, okay. Right. Sorry. Brief change. So we will just say where we are. But members of the public, thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. Thank you.